lighting's a little weird in here, but I wanted to show something in the background. That box right there is I did a video on that last year. It's a lie detector machine, a genuine government CIA issue lie detector machine that Manuel Noriega failed back in the 70s. And what happened in that was the State Department had overruled the local Army intelligence and the CIA people on who to pick to be the next leader of Panama in kind of a rigged thing. But the way Noriega came to power was he murdered his rivals. He arranged to have the priest who actually was the favorite for becoming the next leader of Panama. He had that guy murdered. He had the other politicians who were also on the list of possible candidates. He had most of them murdered. And then stage a coup d'etat to become the America's guy in Panama. And he was a bad guy, but he couldn't really get rid of him. Another bad guy, and it was a different Army intelligence guy who told me about how they handled that guy, was Somoza down in Nicaragua. And Somoza was basically Jimmy Carter had approved but didn't order the killing of Somoza after the killing of a couple of American journalists down there who were covering the revolution. And what that happened basically was some Nicaraguan army people had kind of lost their temper. They knew that a lot of journalists were sympathetic to the communist cause, and they were mad. Okay, they were mad because these people had run around with cameras, basically trying to incriminate them, and championing the rebel cause, that sort of a thing. And they got mad, and there was on video, it was on CBS News or something, where they ordered this guy to get on the ground and then just shot him. That was, and then when Somoza was assassinated, it was made to look like the Sandinistas do it, and what one of the Army intelligence guys said, no, we did that. And the reason is they knew that Somoza was going to be out of power anyway. They didn't want to financially support him in exile and have him continue causing problems. And Somoza was actually the role model for the dictator in a Schwarzenegger movie. Golly, what was that? It was one of Schwarzenegger's big shoot-'em-up movies in the 80s. But Somoza was a role model for that dictator in that movie. And Commando, that was it. Schwarzenegger's movie Commando. But the idea was they felt, Somoza was a bad guy. They weren't going to let him live because the Panamanian dictator was a bad enough guy. And there was a lot of disputes over Idi Amin, too, because a lot of them didn't like Idi Amin. In fact, because of his hosting, I think it was one of the Palestinian groups in the Entebbe hijacking, they kind of wanted to get Idi Amin, but they were never allowed to. But the guys I knew were not active in Africa. And but they were telling me about how they dealt with some rioters in Germany. One guy in particular would tell me how he dealt with rioters in Germany. He was there as a photographer. He was following them around. He figured out who the communist cadre were for a particular group, and during a riot, he shot him. And he figured he'd maybe get away with it in confusion, but people. There were other photographers around. Somebody got a picture of him shooting these guys, and so he was put on trial for it. Now, the way the German law worked at the time, and they decided to go ahead and try him according to local law, was self-defense wasn't a good enough defense on that, and apparently the manner in which he shot him wasn't, he wasn't really self-defense. But they were determined to be enemy combatants. They were able to prove in court that these guys were enemy combatants, that they were sent there from East Germany, that they were there on a mission, they were there on a mission of violence to overthrow the government. And because they were there on a mission of violence, they were enemy combatants, even though they weren't carrying firearms at the time. They were throwing bricks and bottles and directing people throw like Molotov cocktails, bricks and bottles. Now, under current American law, the Molotov cocktail is considered a deadly device. So if somebody's throwing a Molotov cocktail, that's the same as firing a weapon. Back then, apparently, that was not considered the same way. So after he was acquitted in court, the U.S. government sent him to Vietnam and set him up to get killed in a situation where he was told that he would be put in with a bunch of journalists as a photographer to take pictures of a Viet Cong-controlled village that was scheduled to be bombed in an air raid a week later, but they needed pictures to compare the before and after on the air raid, because then they could figure out which hooches got rebuilt first, which ones probably had a tunnel complex under them, and there was no real plan for a ground operation there anytime soon. But they were doing this thing with mixing intelligence operatives in with journalists in order to get before and after pictures on the air raid. Well, as soon as he's in there taking pictures with a group of journalists, the air raid begins. And this thing wasn't supposed to happen for another week. So he spent a U.S. air raid in a Viet Cong bunker with the Viet Cong, realizing the U.S. government was every bit as intent on killing him as they were for killing them. And he had been promoted and sent to Vietnam in relation to shooting some communist agents. And so this isn't one of those 007 license to kill situations, and that guy had fairly good connections outside of the military too. He was a Freemason. He was kind of an upper middling ranking with the Freemasons, and that was supposed to, kind of like help with somebody's kind of got his back. And as it was, there's factions in that sort of a thing. So, some other factions had approved to get rid of him, is what they had done. And later, he kind of got them to change their mind or something like that. Or they approve an attempt, but they won't approve repeated attempts, because it kind of like there's a whole point system and referee thing that these guys will do when the factions don't like each other. And he died of old age. He was in his early 80s, and he died in, I think, 95. I'm sorry, 2005. But that guy was pretty well connected, and he was not allowed to do shooting spree during a riot. Okay, that's basically what he did. He figured out who the bad guys were. He went on a shooting spree in their little meeting area. And as well connected as he was, and he was a government agent at the time, they wouldn't let him get away with it, even though it was legal, and it was determined to be legal in a court of law. And so when I start seeing comments and stuff, and somebody's like, "Well, you better have your AK-47 ready. The riot's going to happen." The LA riots in the early 90s were more like guerrilla warfare, because people would jump in cars, go to another location, and there was a lot of shooting. These guys were, LA's a spread out city, okay? There's that song, "Nobody Walks in LA." They would jump in cars, go to a place, get out of the cars, do their thing, riot, loot, shoot, jump in cars, go to another thing. And so these people were pretty freeway mobile. They knew the streets, they knew the roads. There was a lot of two-way radio traffic at the time. Cell phones were pretty rare at that time, but people had them, okay? And the cell phones never turned off. They were fully functional the whole time. The other thing is, a lot of people had beepers and pagers, and they would communicate with different codes on the pagers. A number code would mean meet at this place or that place, and you have a meeting, and I get a code book, a little sheet of paper with codes, and the codes would go around on pagers, and it could mass broadcast to multiple pagers too. That was the other thing they could do back then. And so that was coordinated guerrilla warfare. It wasn't quite a spontaneous riot. And when the U.S. government, Army intelligence people, and all those types of people had sorted through the communication that took place during the LA riots, they found out that it was highly organized. A lot of stuff there was highly organized by people who had to have been trained in exactly what they were doing to highly organize that stuff. Now, I've been out of the loop for a while, but I'm guessing that was recognized in Ferguson. Now in Baltimore, now here's where it gets kind of interesting. A lot of the people that were organizing stuff in Ferguson were from Baltimore. Okay, they were looking for a battlefield that wouldn't necessarily be in their own backyard, but now this thing's happening in Baltimore, which may or may not have been spontaneous. Now, spontaneous riots work on one set of dynamics. Planned stuff is going to work on a different set of dynamics. There's a lot of stuff that's going to be similar, but the dynamic is different on a planned operation because there's strategic planning involved. These people are after a political goal. They're going to be after certain smaller pieces of tactical goals. In the LA riots, they had a lot of tactical goals for capturing gun shops and wholesale distributors. I think there was one called Bumblebee Wholesale got hit pretty hard. There was a Walmart's. Walmart's would get hit, and there was a big dry cleaning place that did police uniforms. They got hit. Okay, so there was a lot of fear. Who's dressed as police now because this police uniform dry cleaner place got hit. Baltimore, I'm not seeing that level of organization. But one thing that's definitely not going to work in any of these situations is, you go on a shooting spree with an assault rifle when people are breaking windows and dancing on cars. Then suddenly you become the bad guy in the eyes of the government. And that's even if one of these government guys does that, you'll see that, maybe they shoot one person or two people. Nobody goes in and goes berserk on a shooting spree because they're just not going to approve it after the fact, and they know it. So it's rarely something. I've never heard of anyone ever getting away with it. Okay, there was a lot going on in the '68 Watch riots that was later critiqued, and the government people decided they weren't going to do things the same way again. And that was when the National Guard got called in and active duty military got called in. '68 Watch riots. What happened in that was the active duty military people tended to back off and not be fully engaged. The National Guard people, who were local and more conservative, more politically involved against the rioters, took that as an opportunity to rush in and game on. Later on, we saw that with the Kent State shootings. Okay, a lot of National Guard guys felt they put up with enough of this crap. They were mad. They got mad and they did something. What happened in '68 Watch riots is they said, hey, these guys are driving around, they have the machine guns on the Jeeps, and they're shooting at anything that moves, and they're having a lot of tit-for-tat skirmishes with different people in the neighborhoods that they were sent to. The Army people pretty much just went in, guarded a few fixed locations, watched, waited for things to die down a little bit, and one of the things that they were doing was telling the firefighters to hold back. If somebody burned something, they said, okay, hold back, let these people gather around the fire, but don't put firefighters at risk in there. And that was the Army, active duty Army tactic. The National Guard guys would run around and play rat patrol. And they said those areas were much more active in the guerrilla warfare aspect because of it. Now, in the riots in the early '90s, the National Guard wasn't given much ammunition, so there was no back and forth. The National Guard, it was 5 rounds per man. In fact, there were a lot of National Guardsmen who were robbed of their weapons at gunpoint because they knew they didn't have enough ammo to fight. The revolutionaries, if you want to call them that, had been told that the National Guard had very little ammo and were not in a position to fight. The gunfights that did take place took place around gun shops, where there was a forced closure of the gun shops, but there was no door-to-door confiscation, there was no unloading of stuff from the gun shops. They were simply closed and guarded. Some of the gun shop owners had provided extra ammo to the National Guardsmen, and so in those situations there were some protracted gunfights, especially after the Bumblebee Wholesale place got hit. Because I believe it was Bumblebee Wholesale. I have to look through some, or I think it was them. It was a gun wholesaler that had warehouses in Los Angeles, and I doubt they're there now. It's possible they are. But Under those circumstances, it was highly recommended that well-armed security guards would be there, and that's another story. I don't think there's any major weapon warehouses in Baltimore. I don't think that's really a target. But when these things were happening in other places, they got to look at what places get targeted. There's also were some self-made movies of, by, and for the Black Panthers, where they detailed targeting National Guard armory, so you would assume they were after concentrations of weapons. By now, in 2015, if they've ever wanted to have weapons, they probably already have them. If they wanted to bring those into play, they probably would already be bringing them into play. They have plenty of people with military and guerrilla warfare experience. So when we see the teenagers thing, breaking glass, it's probably spontaneous, but then there's a leadership element that could show up and start trying to guide them or doing something. And that got to some other strategies, which usually the way the government works is nowadays, is they get to the so-called community leaders, who are quite often the riot instigators, and they try to make a deal with them to calm things down. That's generally the accepted thing. 40 years ago, say 50 years ago, 68, they were into assassinating leadership. That's really not something that happens very much outside of the prison system now. In the prison system, they still do that kind of thing. Out in the streets, it's not nearly, it's just not something you're seeing much of. What they usually do is they look for a political solution, and because there's a history of political payout in these things, that's where the riot for reward mentality starts to take place, because it's effective.